How's everyone doing? Yeah. That was a fabulous talk, wasn't it? It is so good. I just need to. Where is it? Full screen. Okay. First of all, this is, it's quite an inspiring gathering because there's so many people here, including Byron, Jenna, who's going to speak, that I've learned so much from. And it's so good to see people who are coming together, who have been sharing ideas and resources with each other and working together towards a collective project. I'm sort of tasked with talking about what's happening across the country and some priorities for change, but I'm a little bit inspired by Byron, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, so you're like, who's that guy, why is he talking? What right does he have to say? What is happening across the country? So just a little bit about myself. The first time my family was deported, I was aged 5. The second time, I was 13. The first time I started doing undocumented work, I was 16 years old. I came to Canada in 2004. So I've been here way too long. And I started organizing around migrant justice in 2007. I began this work with an organization called Known as Illegal Toronto. And we started that work in shelters. We were seeing, as Byron was talking about, women in shelters, and the shelter workers were calling the Canada Border Services Agency to come in and arrest those women who were trying to seek shelter and support. And we began to organize, and if they weren't calling, CBSA was just showing up and workers were handing them over. And so, we were actually able to successfully stop that practice. And since then, since 2007, the last 11 years, I've had, the honor to walk alongside people fighting for an end to immigration detention and indefinite detention, stop deportations, work on campaigns around Sanctuary City. And in 2008, we began to work also at this project called the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, which initially was just a conversation between caregivers and farm workers. We took a bunch of caregivers from Toronto to the farms just for people to talk to each other. And we said, look, there's actually something similar that is happening here between these different migrant worker categories. For those folks who were around in 2008, we really were talking in very different ways. The caregivers were over here, the farm workers were over here. Even the frame of migrant worker wasn't really being used. And it's funny, the first name that we picked for ourselves was the Coalition for Change, Live-in Caregivers, Temporary Foreign Workers, and Agricultural Workers. Because we were like, migrant worker, it was a real mouthful. The website was very long. No, there was no website. We were just coming together. And so since 2008, we've been working with migrant workers. And now we're a coalition of 49 organizations in Ontario who are frontline organizations, autonomous migrant worker groups, community health centers, labor unions, faith-based organizations, legal clinics, and others. And our work has been about lifting the voices of people who are directly affected and trying to transform and transition organizations who are working with migrant workers to center them. So, when I talk about Sanctuary City, and I just, really want to thank Byron for reminding us that concept began in the Global South. And in fact, most of the work that we're following in the steps of is actually happening in the Global South. I also want to begin by acknowledging that we are on Indigenous territories, that these are the lands that have been taken care of by the Mississaugas of New Credit. These are lands that have been taken care of by the Haudenosaunee people and the Anishinaabeg people. And that our work of social justice, our work of collective transformation could not happen without centuries of resistance and resilience by Indigenous warriors, by Indigenous sisters, by Indigenous community members, and by Indigenous land defenders who've shown us what it means to survive and thrive and be resilient and be part of a resurgence right now to defend these territories. And this is particularly important. I'm not doing just a land acknowledgement to remind us where we sit, but that when we're talking about migrants, when we're talking about immigrants, we're not simply talking about access to citizenship rights. We're not saying that we will organize our communities to become part of a settler colonial state, right? We're also not talking about access to services from the same settler colonial state, right? It isn't simply about, so let me just ground that a little bit. This is a story many of you have heard. A few years ago, we had a number of migrant workers unable to access healthcare. This is a health forum, so I'll use a health example. And when they were going to the hospitals, there was nobody who spoke Spanish. The employer was sending their translator who was recording who was sick, and there was medical repatriation happening from it, right? And so the first step that we did in talking about organizing these workers to be able to get healthcare was to actually talk about what languages used to be spoken here. Why is it that English is the lingua franca in these hospitals and institutions? And then we also talked about the ways in which indigenous languages in their community, these are Spanish-speaking workers, largely from Guatemala, some from El Salvador, about what had happened in those countries around indigenous people and languages, right? And what does it mean to access decolonized health services? And so eventually we were able to create a system where these workers are now able to get healthcare, where the hospital has changed its practices. They're not communicating with the employers. They're at hours where workers can participate. They're doing it in the language of the workers. But those workers are, since then, we've been arranging visits and connecting them with indigenous communities. And they understand that then when they're fighting for their rights to access services, they're trying to fight for it in the context of a settler colony and an anti-colonial struggle, right? So the invitation for us is to really, really concretize what it means to do this work, not just in the context of a land acknowledgement, but in all of our practices. Now, in terms of a cross-country checkup, I want to talk about a little bit about where are we in the country? So this is kind of the provincial government map. I know for many people that block of red is very calming. It's not for me, but it's this idea that more or less there are sort of these liberal orange governments and things are more or less fine. Now, I'm going to give you an analogy that I find, generally I never try to compare Canada to the US. That seems a strange thing that Canadians do. But let me try and give you an analogy. 2 years ago, this country elected their Obama. 6 years from now, they're about to elect their Trump. We are seeing, in terms of deindustrialization, in terms of the unemployment rate, in terms of what is happening on the ground, a shift in the political landscape of all of the different provinces, which is creating, this is what happened in the US, Ohio, the Deep South, all of these places saw first Republican governors come in those provinces and actually be part of cuts to services, etc. And those people in Canada are waiting in the wings. In Alberta, Jason Kenney is trying to take hold. In Ontario, Doug Ford is breathing down our necks. In Quebec, you have the CAQ rising in the polls, and the elections are this year. We are seeing this transition towards not just any kind of conservative government, but a hard right, racist governments that are actually building from that Trump momentum. Right? And so we are seeing 6 years from now, we're hoping right now, we want to be aware, we want to be doing the things that they did not do in the United States, and so are now facing this, not just the fact that Trump is in power, but across the country, there is a shrinking of services, there is an expansion of racist and xenophobic attacks, and there is a huge impact on the global South in terms of the expansion of the US military empire. Now, it also is a reminder that a lot of the work that we're doing is actually happening at this very provincial level. Brian talked about sanctuary cities and then the necessity to go to the province. Much of the stuff that we talk about that impacts people's lives, healthcare, labor standards, social assistance, wages, housing, policing, these are all controlled in this country at this level. And that this transition and this shift, particularly because people haven't really been able to win many gains here, is going to be particularly impactful. Now, what is happening on the immigration end is we're seeing, of course, we've been saying this since at least 2008, there's an expansion of temporariness, etc. I have a couple of graphs there. I want to go through them a little bit more, but I'll also throw out some more examples. The one on your left, the blue line is international students coming into the country, the gray line is the temporary foreign workers, and the orange line is the permanent residents. Those are just numbers from 2014 to 2017. As you can see, there's a constant increase in the numbers of international students. Right now, just in Ontario, we're told that there's over 1 million international students. 50% of whom are in non-public post-secondary institutions. That means that they are coming here, they will not be able to get any access to permanent residency. Most of them are coming, sitting in classes for a couple of months, and then going out and working. So they're essentially temporary foreign workers who come for a short period and then leave. I speak more about international students because I imagine over the last 2 days you've heard a lot about temporary foreign workers. Similarly, this is the one on the left is the number of international mobility program workers. Just in Ontario right now, there are about 70,000 IMP workers, but as you can see, the red line is the temporary foreign workers, the blue line is the IMP workers. We can also see, for example, there's a 47,000 person, or nearly 50,000 person backlog in the refugee system. There is a 15,000 person backlog in the caregiver system. The entire system is moving towards temporariness. When you add all of these numbers up, we're talking about upwards of 2.5 million people, I'm not talking about tourists, who are on temporary work permits in the country. All right, temporary work or study permits, many of them engaged in low-wage, precarious worker, pushed out of status. And the backlog means that the system is faltering, and it means that the total number of undocumented people are increasing across the country. We just did a status check of all our organizations, all 49 said that they are seeing more undocumented people coming through to them. Just to give you a sense of this entire shift to temporariness is also a shift towards undocumented people. I'm not going to talk in great length about how egregious and violent and exclusionary being in this program is. I'm sure you've heard a lot about it. A lot of you are doing very critical research looking at various angles. You know, we know about low wages, we know about injuries at work, we know about the gendered impact of all of this. We're talking about inaccessible healthcare, we know there's indefinite immigration detention in this country, there's housing inaccessibility, etc., etc. We know the problems. The point is to understand is that they are increasing in temporariness, and they're often impacting workers that many of us are not necessarily in direct touch with, right? Including international students, including refugee claimants in the backlogs, including this new wave of border crossers that are coming in, including the IMP workers. There's a whole the largest section of temporary migration are the people who are least involved. And I say this as a member of an organization who largely just focus on farm workers, caregivers, and some refugees and some undocumented workers. This is not a criticism, this is a collective realization we need to come to together. Now, at the same time as this is happening, I'm sorry if some of this is triggering, it is hard and it's real, is we are seeing a massive increase in racism and xenophobia. It took me 8 minutes to find these photos, I timed it. Basically, across the country, there are these organizations that are emerging who are emboldened to come out and be racist and xenophobic. For example, just in Toronto, there has been a lot of organizing happening with the homeless community by these neo-Nazi and right-wing organizations because the refugees, border crossers are being brought into those shelters. In other cities, we saw people organize workers around migrant workers are stealing your jobs, right? The kind of strategies that people are using, they're running food banks, shelters. I'm talking about neo-Nazis and white supremacist organizations. They're running shelters, they're running food banks, they're running soup kitchens across this country. In Edmonton, they started a drop-in service for people who are overdosing and providing overdose prevention and fentanyl. These are the mechanisms of community organizing that many of us actually aren't that good at, and the racist right is getting better and better at. And they've begun to focus, as you know, most of their organizing around migration and immigration. Right, a lot of the demonstrations that have taken place by the National Days of Action, they were organized. There was one in February of this year, there was one in February of last year. 60 cities were organized, and all of those organizations were framed around immigration. In Quebec, in Laval, where all the border crossing is happening, the neo-Nazis have really sort of focused on anti-immigration, right? So a very particular story is emerging, right? There's a shift towards temporariness. There's this waiting in the wings of the Conservatives and the Tories, and there is this neo-Nazi right wing that's emerging on a national scale and level, right? I do not mean this as a what happened? Okay, I don't just mean this as, oh, all is bad, we should give up, but it's kind of to sound the alarm, right? To remind ourselves that, again, we're in year 2, we're going to have 6 more years of your or whoever's Obama, and then you get the Trump. So there's a 6-year period in which a very systematic, grassroots, community-led, migrant worker-centered organizing needs to happen, right? This is a very basic organizing precept. You need a vision, you need to organize, you need to mobilize. What is a vision? A vision is an idea that brings together the maximum number of people together to act. We need a concept that's anti-racist, that's inclusive, that inspires people to act, that fundamentally challenges the current status quo, and does it with an actual method towards organizing, right? What does it mean to organize? To organize is to actually put people, directly affected people and others at the center. Put people in rooms, put people in workshops, put people in forums, put people in presentations, and act together. What is mobilizing? Mobilizing is basically what most of us believe political actions is. We have protests, we have petition signatures, we go out and then we go back home, but we don't actually act together or converse with each other. This together is a method. It's a method that social movements have used for a long time. We have to understand where we fit and how those 3 fit together. I'm going to propose what this looks like in the near future, not over the next 6 years, but in the near future, I invite you to act towards all of them. So the vision. The photo on the top left is a photo from a demonstration that took place in 1981. This is a group of caregivers who surrounded then immigration minister asking for landed status now. The photo next to it is from 2016. We want status upon arrival. The photo below is it from 2014. For a long time, the migrant justice movement has had a very simple ask. No temporariness, full status for everyone. We want a single tier system. Everybody who comes here with full status. People who are undocumented have full status. This is a simple idea, but it's a transformative one. We're insisting that people cannot be treated as commodities, right? Because the purpose of a temporary immigration system is that a certain kind of exploitation and abuse and exclusion is okay. We refuse to acknowledge that. It is anti-colonial because it says that citizenship should not be imposed by this form of government, right? But that citizenship or access to services or access to basic dignity is a collective project that we produce and create together. It's pragmatic because there is actually a permanent immigration system for a large number of people. It's the permanent residents coming in. It's historical because it's been the call of our movements for decades and decades and decades. And it brings everyone into the fold, right? This is a vision that many migrant organizations across this country have been raising over and over again, and it needs to be echoed. We want status on landing, we want status for all. Now, in terms of organizing, I want to give you a very basic, very accessible framework. There are 2 critical moments coming up for migrant workers. Here, organizing, that means I'm speaking about people who are working directly to build migrant worker power. In November of 2019, the caregiver program is going to expire. The government is currently working to assess it and try and produce a new program. Remember, this is the basic bare bones of where the rest of the temporariness program, temporariness has been invented through. It's through the domestic worker program and then through the ag worker program over the last 50 years. The second point is the federal government is reviewing the agricultural worker program. This has not yet been announced. We know about it. It was supposed to be announced on May 1st. Still hasn't happened. They're very, very effective out there. At both of these junctures, there is a necessity to ensure that migrant workers are involved and centered in what comes after. Over this entire summer, the federal government's policy people are going to be designing the new stage of this program. They will be giving it to the politicians in the fall with the expected legislation, regulation, or policy coming by December. Okay? So we're sitting in May. We might see this happen over the next 7 months, which means for people who are working with migrant workers, now is the time for political education. Now is the time to document trends. Now is the time to build the confidence of the directly affected people to participate in these processes. But knowing that we will not win all of these things, We have to organize in a way to build power, because come December 2018, January 2019 starts, and the entire federal government is going to move towards an electoral strategy, with the elections coming in October of 2019. So people who are working with migrants, we need to organize our communities and our people to not just win changes in this round, because we're not going to win everything, but start imagining what it would look like to make immigration part of the elections agenda in 2019. The current Immigration and Refugee Protection Act came into force in 2002. Basically, for those of you who were there and remember, 2001 happens, September 2001 happens, the liberals in that bottom drawer were sitting on this Immigration Act. They saw this huge chaos, people feeling very securitized, and they pushed this Immigration Act through. They were sitting on it for a long time. They wanted to severely limit people's ability to access decent lives and dignity and justice, and they pushed it through. It's now been 16 years. That act has had almost no changes. If we are going to be able to actually fundamentally deal with the questions of immigration and migration, the act needs to be open. But it needs to be done in coordination, and it needs to be done centering directly affected people. Right now is the moment where we can be building our power in these rounds of negotiations for the next round to follow. This is for everyone who's working with migrant workers. Now, for people who are organizing, providing services in advocacy, so these are folks, you might be doing, the work is coming through, but you're not actually creating collective spaces for them. I have 3 very simple things for you. 1, connect, show up to support migrant worker groups. If there is, if you are in Vancouver, you got to show up for sanctuary health events. If you are in any city, find what it is that local organizations led by directly affected people, refugees, migrants, immigrants are doing, show up and act for them. For those of you who are in Toronto, there's a National Day of Action for Caregivers taking place here on May 13th in Toronto, 2 p.m., Yonge and Dundas Square. Show up, right? You'll see there are going to be dozens and dozens of migrant caregivers, undocumented and not, who are going to be taking up space in the city to demand status now. We need people to just show up individually. But we also need to be connecting the people you are servicing, the people you're doing advocacy for. You need to be directing. If you are a health clinic and you've got, you're providing healthcare services, connect those people to local collective organizing efforts. If you're a legal clinic, you're someone coming in, whether it's for help and social assistance or housing or immigration or employment standards, get them the services, but then direct them to join organizations and groups. And finally, find your niche, right? I'll just give you one very brief example from here in Ontario. In this current round, probably many of you have heard, Nadira spoke about this on the first day. We are seeing, we've just won Bill 148, which is a massive improvement in labor rights. One of the things that was won in Bill 148 was the first time in Canada that there's 2 days of paid personal emergency leave and 8 days on top of that of guaranteed personal emergency or sick leave. Okay? There are also many other health-related things that came out of. You don't need a doctor's note to get off work. These are actually really substantive changes that people in low-wage work need to access. How was that won? It was won because a group of doctors, nurses, health practitioners created something called the Decent Work, Decent Health Network and mobilized in the health sector for these things. They were able to take a portion of the overall struggle and make it their own in coordination with the larger labor rights movement and move forward. This is something that all of us need to be doing, whether you work with a health organization, an aid services organization, a legal clinic, or you're a group of doctors, you're a group of students. There are many, many ways to take this overall vision of status for all and status now and status on arrival and find your path into it, right? I've put up some examples. So the first one I put up is medical inadmissibility. One of our comrades was going to speak today from the Caregivers Action Center. She's not here, unfortunately. On medical inadmissibility, so just a little bit on that. Medical inadmissibility is basically a section of the immigration law that says that if a single member of your family is a person with disabilities, your entire family cannot get permanent residency. Caregivers organized along with HIV/AIDS affected folks, people in the larger disability justice community, and we're just able to win some minor improvements, but they're not done. In this entire fight, we saw very, very few health organizations step up and participate, right? We didn't get coalitions of doctors speaking about it. We didn't see, many organizations. That is still an opportunity for people to organize and participate in. There are so many things. I mean, there's the impact, we can talk about the impact of lack of status on racialized women's health. We can talk about detentions in work. There are so many different ways to approach this question, but if we have this broad vision that we are all raising within the context of our work, while also supporting organizations, while connecting our clients, as Byron pointed out, the problems with the term, into broad movement-based work, we can actually create the kind of change we need right now, and we have a moment to make real. Because that is what we're up against, right? We can either put forward a transformative, bold, positive, forward-facing vision and try and organize ourselves towards it, or we're going to end up in a defensive position protecting the too few rights that our people have. That's all for me. Thank you.